Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. We're just going to let a couple more people join in. For everyone who's already here, I would first invite you to turn on your interpretation settings. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a globe type of icon or symbol. So you can click on it and then click on the language you want to listen to the webinar in. So if you want to listen to it in English, just click English. And then when someone will be speaking in French, you'll be hearing it in French.
For those of you who speak French, this webinar will mostly be in English, but some of our panelists will speak French. You can enable interpretation by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. Click on French, then you'll be able to hear the panel in French.
Thanks to Coop Largo for helping us with interpretation. And yeah, hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, Decrim Across Movement. I'm Naja Kassir. I work at the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. I live in Jojage, also known as Montreal. The custodian of these lands are the Ganegahaga of Ganesatake and Ganawage. I will be very quick with my introduction today. I just want to do some housekeeping. So first of all, my colleagues Ryan and Jess are going to be in the chat. Just repeating the instruction that I will be giving you. We are going to have a Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. So if you have any question, I would say first write them down, wait a little bit to see if they're going to be answered. And what we're trying to do today is to connect the patterns of criminalizations that we notice across different types of movements. And so for the Q&A, I would really appreciate if you keep that in mind and kind of help us in putting the pieces of the puzzle together. But of course, ask any questions you want. You can ask them in the Q&A button right next to, like right at the bottom of your screen, because if you ask them in the chat, we might lose them. And you can also upvote the questions that you want to see answered the most. And for the people who have joined and didn't hear what I said at the beginning, this webinar will be both in French and English. So if you speak English, click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. There's an icon in the shape of a globe and click English. This way you'll hear everything in English.
If you speak French, it will be half in French, half in English. You can click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen, and you can click in French. Then you'll be able to hear everything in French.
I'll switch back to English now. Without further ado, I will invite DJ Larkin, the Executive Director of the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, to open this conversation. So go for it, DJ.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. I'm really thrilled to get to introduce this panel, and thanks for rejoining us for the reschedule. Criminalization is, it's a hallmark of drug prohibition. It dates back to even earlier than today's drug laws. So looking back to British vagrancy laws from the 1700s and social views of drunkenness that were really more about social class than they were about substance use. And then moving forward to the early days of colonization on these lands, and I'm joining from Coast Salish lands, here on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. Here we saw the criminalization of Indigenous people in possession of alcohol and the targeting of Chinese and Japanese businesses as opium dens being used as tactics to protect white settler community power. And targeting and attempting to control and marginalize specific communities, often explicitly based on race and class, is deeply ingrained into the structure of drug prohibition. It's not an accidental outcome of prohibition, it's central to the intentions of it. In 2023, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights stated in a report that, quote, in many countries, the enforcement of drug laws has been more effective as a system of racial control than as a control to reduce drug markets. At CDPC, we've been involved in policy reform and education on drug decriminalization for over a decade. And in the past few years, decriminalization has been the source of some policy reform and a lot of public debate and backlash. And we know that being targeted by and experiencing criminalization doesn't start and end with one law or one policy sector. It is about how governments and law enforcement control some bodies and incarcerate, harm, or render invisible the people most impacted by multiple failed systems. So our hope today is in bringing together communities for a conversation to build connection and understanding of how criminalization impacts us all. Well, we may all focus our efforts in specific sectors or on specific laws. We do have a shared interest in finding paths forward that create the conditions of safety for all people, not through criminalization, incarceration, or punishment, but rather through things like housing, income, health, social and cultural policies that respect autonomy and work for people and not just for politicians. Working towards decriminalization and drug policy, in our view, has the potential to improve the lives of many people and to redistribute resources towards policies and services that we all need. But when we talk about criminalization and decriminalization of drugs without connecting with allied communities, we rapidly see how similar harms get reproduced through other laws and how scapegoating is used to justify harsher policing and backtracking on policy reform. A clear example, in British Columbia, just over 2 years ago, we undertook a limited attempt to decriminalize possession of small amounts of some drugs. Almost immediately, people who had a lot to gain started whipping up public anxiety, fueling misinformation and backlash. In the midst of a crippling housing crisis, where we were seeing dramatic increases in homelessness, decriminalization of people who use drugs became a distraction and a scapegoat. The very real problems in our communities, including poverty, inadequate supports, lack of housing, were more visible. And instead of addressing those problems, politicians pointed to public drug use as the problem. And with that, they sought to pass a new law, Bill 34, that empowered police to arrest individuals who refused to leave or be removed from a park or a sidewalk, simply based on the belief that they recently used drugs in a public space. And as the conversation evolved, again, politicians consistently framed a narrative that blamed individuals for systems failures. Those failures to reform policy and to resource our health system were reframed as problem people who were unable or unwilling to, quote unquote, choose treatment. And this led then to increased calls for the use of forced detention and treatment without patient consent. So whether current political rhetoric on that focuses on the substances someone uses, someone's housing, health, or immigration status, or how a person earns income, there we hold common threads. And it always comes back to scapegoating people to distract from the need to reform policy. And that's not really surprising. Our system needs significant change. It's a big ask. It is far easier to play on public fears and misunderstandings and to promise oversimplified solutions than it is to do the work to fix those big systems changes. Again and again, we see people in power try to create public support for government policies that focus on controlling a person's behavior rather than fixing the system that is making us all less safe. And we know that governance does not work, and it doesn't make our communities healthier or safer. We know that, as you know, as advocates and communities, that we can work better and stronger when we build shared learning, mutual support across our sectors. To hold solidarity so that improvements in one community are not at the expense of another. And that's the core reason why we're honored to host this conversation about what decriminalization really means across sectors and experiences, and to explore how do we build that common ground and support. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panelists, so I will stop there.
Thanks so much, DJ, for explaining to people our intention behind hosting this webinar today. And so the first perspective that we wanted to highlight is the perspective of the criminalization of people living with HIV. So we're welcoming Muluba Habanyama to share this perspective with us today. So go for it, Muluba.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for having me. Hello, everyone. My name is Maluba, and I am currently in Toronto, Treaty 13. Very grateful to be on these lands as a settler and somebody of the descent of the African descent I really own, and honor that we are on stolen land, and I am grateful to live and work on this land. My pronouns are she and her. I currently wear many different hats. I am the spokesperson for the Canadian Foundation for AIDS Research. I'm the Director of Communications at the Ontario AIDS Network, and I'm a steering committee member of the Canadian Coalition to Reform HIV Criminalization. But first and foremost, and in every room that I am in, I am a Black woman living with HIV for my entire life. And so this cause is not only personal to me, but it's something that I think greater that we need to learn about in the world. So I'm excited to come and talk to you about it. So first, let's talk about HIV. I think just getting on that standard of HIV. So HIV has long been around since the 80s and is something that is can be transmitted through bodily fluids. When HIV first came about, it was obviously this epidemic that was, considered something that was very racialized, that was stigmatized towards Black communities and towards men who have sex with men. But HIV has long advanced. As somebody who has lived with HIV my entire life, I can tell you, as an 8-year-old girl, I was taking 6 pills twice a day, and now as a 31-year-old woman, I take 2 pills once a day, and there's now injectables that you can take once a month for HIV. And we are now at a point where a person living with HIV, if they take their medication and are adherent, they can get their virus so low to something that we call undetectable, which is under 20 copies, and they cannot sexually transmit to their sexual partner. For mothers living with HIV, it is 1% chance of transmitting to your child. So we've come far in advance when we talk about HIV transmission, and far in advance of the medication and advancement of HIV. And I tell you that so that we can understand how far we've come with the science of HIV, but how far we have not come with the criminalization of HIV. So HIV criminalization, down to the point, is that if a person living with HIV has sex with a person not living with HIV, they can be criminalized. Yes, you heard that right. They can be criminalized. It does not matter about transmission. It does not matter if they gave the person HIV. It is just the fact that they put the person at risk for HIV. And there are many different cases where people have been prosecuted, imprisoned, punished, and have been on the sex offender list for the rest of their life for potentially putting somebody at harm of HIV. And this has been long happening in Canada, as long as I can remember, as long as HIV has been around. But as we talked about at the beginning, HIV is far advanced. And so it is wondering that why is this case what it is? So another thing to point out is that HIV does not have its strict law. HIV, if you find HIV in the criminal code, it is attached to sexual assault, because the belief was if a person is not living with HIV and were to have sex with a person living with HIV, they would not actually consent, and so that would be sexual assault, which is why people would end up on the sexual offenders list. And the charge usually would be sexual assault, aggravated sexual assault, and in some cases, sexual assault with a deadly weapon. The deadly weapon meaning the person's body or the person's sexual part. And so we have long come in Canada where there have been groups of people that have advocated that, one, people living with HIV are not the enemy. When more than two people have sex, most of the time it should be consensual. And so why is the onus on the person living with HIV to handle everybody's health care, and what does that look like? And what are we having with these cases, and how are we harming people? There have been reported many cases of people actually disclosing their status, but then there's something vengeful afterwards where a person comes out and says, oh no, you didn't disclose to me. So what does that prove? I actually always tell people a story that is almost funny, but also traumatic, of when I was 18 years old and went to an HIV organization. I was sitting down with the aunties, and they would say, when you had sex with a man, make sure he wears a condom and keep the condom in the freezer with his sperm, so you can prove that you did disclose to him and you have that proof forever. This is the fear that people living with HIV that have had for several years of being criminalized. And when we talk about criminalization, the most people that have been criminalized under this law have been Black men. LGBTQ Black men and straight Black men in the criminal code, followed by the disproportionate communities that you can imagine. So there has been many advocacy. There's been much advocacy about HIV criminalization and how the criminal code does not make sense because, like I told you at the beginning, a lot of people living with HIV are on adherent treatment and are undetectable, so they cannot transmit the virus. And so the idea of putting somebody at risk for transmitting the virus, what does that exactly mean to be at risk? And so the government had changed or kind of had tweaked the policy to say that a person living with HIV there must be a condom worn and the person must be undetectable. If one of two of those things are not present in the sexual activity, they can be criminalized. And that's where it kind of was held at the point. A lot more activism did take place. And about 5 years ago in 2018, we had advanced to where the Attorney General was advocating for HIV criminalization to get decreased and for judges to get more education. I do want to play this quick video that is from 2018 that kind of gives you a perspective of what HIV criminalization was looking like at that time. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. Make sure to share it with sound.
What if your medical condition could land you in prison? In Canada, that's the situation faced by people living with HIV. They continue to risk jail time if they don't tell their sexual partner they have HIV. People living with HIV can be prosecuted for aggravated sexual assault, go to prison, and be listed as sex offenders for life. This can happen even if they did not intend to cause harm and did not transmit HIV. Almost 200 people across Canada have been charged, including in cases where there was no risk of passing on the virus. With treatment, people with HIV can live long and healthy lives. HIV can be suppressed in the body, meaning there's no risk of transmission. But criminalization discourages people from getting tested or seeking treatment, and no other health condition has ever been criminalized this way. Thankfully, things are changing, but more needs to be done. In December 2018, the Attorney General of Canada directed federal lawyers to stop prosecuting people whose HIV is suppressed. She also directed these lawyers to generally not prosecute people who used a condom, took treatment as prescribed, or just had oral sex, because she concluded that there is likely no realistic possibility of transmission in these circumstances. This directive is a step in the right direction, but it isn't enough and only applies in Canada's 3 territories. We need all provinces to limit prosecutions against people living with HIV, and the Government of Canada needs to change our criminal code. HIV non-disclosure is not sexual assault. Cases of intentional transmission are incredibly rare. Criminalizing people living with HIV is discriminatory and harmful. It's bad for human rights, it's bad for public health, and it doesn't help anyone. You can take action. Visit hivcriminalization.ca to get involved in this important fight.
So that video shows you where we were at 2018, and in that video it also explains how HIV is mainly a public issue. And so the fact that the government had taken this virus and had put it into a legal issue, into a legal jargon, is already a dangerous tactic in itself. And again, that was in 2018. So looking at where we are at now, the Canadian Coalition to Reform HIV Criminalization was developed in about 7 years ago to push the provinces, which the Attorney General had directed, to take on the cause of HIV criminalization with a lot of stalling tactics. Last year in May, the coalition met with the Attorney General, Minister Varani of the Liberal Party, and it had a fruitful conversation that I thought that really advanced, where there was a lot of questions, there was a lot of discussions. There was a lot, I will say, from the federal government that thought we would just give you little pennies and here and there, and a lot of stuff that were unacceptable. It was a very productive conversation and things that did move forward. However, in June of last year, suddenly the coalition did not hear from the attorney general's office anymore, and suddenly there was a lot of quiet activity and not a lot of responses. And then we had heard by September of last year that the attorney general had decided to currently drop, and they were not going to move forward with the reform of Canadian HIV criminalization. And later on, that was the excuse that, the Attorney General was put up to it. The Trudeau party was having a lot of issues with the Liberal Party. And so, again, this is something that had been stalled and had been has been long waited by HIV advocates and activists. Currently, the federal government has said that this is on the provinces to handle and looking at different provincial laws and regulations. And I can explain to you the issue with that is first, like we mentioned, with a public health issue. Many of you on the call that I can see in the chat are from Ontario. As you know, in Ontario, we do not have universal health coverage. People living with HIV cannot just get their drugs very easily and accessible. So that also puts in the fact of many people living with HIV cannot potentially get to undetectable. And how is that an issue? The issue is that they're not even getting medications. And so in that phase, we're not having people that are getting tested, are getting on treatment. And now we're also putting them in this line of potentially getting criminalized. Some provinces do have universal health coverage. It may not be as accessible as we think, but they do have universal health coverage. And so looking at the provinces and looking at the differences, they are leaving the discretion to the judges. And now, frankly, not all judges have the education of what HIV looks like today in 2025. So leaving that to judges' discretion. There have been cases, and I'm just reading from my notes. There was a case of a judge in a certain province that once they learned that the defendant was living with HIV, put on gloves. Far away from the defendant's desk, not understanding what HIV was, had put on gloves to protect themselves. And so that education, leaving it to the judges or leaving it to the provinces, again, puts people at risk and puts people in the line of, do I like you, do I not, do I think you're putting somebody at risk, and villainizing people living with HIV. Again, putting on other factors. Is it a person living with HIV that uses drugs? Is it a person living with HIV that is doing sex work? Is it a person living with HIV that is Black? Is it a person living with HIV that is part of the LGBTQ? So many other factors that we're seeing into that is playing in the court system, where we're looking at racism, stigma, homophobia, that is just not fair. And again, when we are talking about sex, which is supposed to be something that is pleasurable, we are now putting the onus on the person living with HIV to be at risk, and we are telling them that their body is a problem, their body is a weapon, and it is very dangerous. And as you can see in that, I have people in my life that have actually been scared to go get tested because sometimes it is rather beneficial, or is looked at beneficial, to not know my status and not be criminalized than it be on record that I knew my status and I potentially put somebody at harm. I want to finish off my presentation by saying that when I was about 9 years old, my mother had brought a man from Zambia, Africa, and she had married him. He became my stepdad, was my stepdad for about 6 years. After he had gotten his papers to be a permanent resident, he had left my mother and he had sued her for non-disclosure. In the papers, he had described that she had not disclosed to him that she was living with HIV, and he described me as somebody that was disabled and needed help from him, and had described bathing me and just things that were not true, and had described HIV as a total different condition. My mother went to court. I watched her for several years, I think about 2 years, fight in court. Luckily, through the immigration papers of when my mother had brought this man, she actually had letters where she had disclosed her status to him. So that case was dropped. So as you can imagine, as a 16-year-old girl at the time and watching that, I had watched my mother be vindicated in court, but about 2 years, or about a year later, she had cancer that we did not know about, and she had fortunately passed away. And so that stress from that had totally belittled her health. And you can imagine at 16 years old, I'd learned this, and now flash forward to my adult life, how I am scared as a Black woman in my 30s in Canada that my body and my right will be looked at as a weapon, and it is a lesson in that. There have been many cases, unfortunately, where we're looking at sexual assault, which is supposed to help people, that have actually been sexually assaulted, where it has actually hindered people. In Montreal, there was a case long before where a woman had reported that she had been sexually assaulted by a man, and when she had charged him with sexual assault, he then turned around and charged her with sexual assault because she was HIV positive. Both cases were either to be dismissed or both people were going to be charged. And so you see how that also puts people at a line where we're not seeing that sexual assault is the benefit of doing it. And so I hope I explained how this is something that is very dangerous and something needs to change. Where we are now is that, as you know, we are in a provincial election in Ontario that was called, and then we will have a federal election at the end of the year. And it is not looking like the party that is going to be elected is going to be more open to this. But we will work with them and we will advocate for them. But we are seeing many lines, and I'm sure the fellow speakers that speak after me will speak with some things that make sense in the term of HIV criminalization. So we do all need to work together, and we see different trajectories of that. HIV criminalization is moving forward, and activists will not stop fighting for the right and the reform of it. But it is a tough hill to get through. And again, I always remind people that HIV is a public health issue, and the science of HIV has advanced tremendously, but the law of HIV has not advanced at all. And it is such a shame, and this country will be worse off if we do not intend it. And I'm going to end it there. And thank you all so much for having me. And I'm looking forward to questions at the end of the show.
Thanks so much, Maluba, for just laying down the facts so clearly and also being very generous in sharing your story. We really all appreciate everything you shared. I think we can already start to see the pieces of the puzzle forming and how, societal issues, the default is put on people and not so much the healthcare systems that are failing us, the education system that are failing us. But I won't say too much because I think it will get clearer and clearer, especially with our next speaker, my colleague Nicole Luongo, who will be speaking specifically on the criminalization of people who use drugs. So Nicole, I invite you to let us know all about this.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole, she, her pronouns. Thanks all for being here today. I am the systems change analyst with the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. I identify as someone who has extensive lived experience of criminalized drug use, involuntary treatment, enforced institutionalization, homelessness, many of the consequences of prohibition. And yeah, I'm here today to kind of discuss the history and kind of current manifestations of drug criminalization, or the criminalization of people who use drugs, and how that kind of connects with other folks in the room as well. So just briefly, when I say drug prohibition as by way of a definition, what I'm actually referring to is kind of this overarching legal framework that we have that prohibits or makes into a criminal offense many or most activities related to the possession, distribution, movement, and manufacturing of certain substances. Canada's federal regime of drug prohibition is called the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, or the CDSA. And of course, provinces and territories do have some control over kind of how prohibition manifests practically, but just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to be speaking primarily to kind of federal level trends. As DJ noted rightly, drug prohibition has always been a tool of settler colonialism, and I really can't overstate that fact. And I'm sure many people in this room, this virtual space, will kind of understand that to a large degree, and it won't be new information. But just to kind of refresh people's memories and draw some kind of historical through lines to our current moment, I'll say briefly that the 1876 Indian Act contained one of Canada's first and often overlooked drug prohibitions. And the act was, of course, fundamentally an assimilationist document. And in 1884, it was amended to make it a crime for an Indigenous person to purchase or consume alcohol or to enter a licensed establishment. It was also a crime to sell alcohol to an Indigenous person. And really the core rationale behind this was that Indigenous peoples who were by then, being dispossessed of their land and traditional ways of living would not diligently work the so-called farmland that had been allotted to them through the reservation system if they were permitted to drink. And a whole bunch happened in the interim that I strongly recommend you look into. I don't have time to fully flesh it out, but I'll just say that it wasn't until the year 1985 that Indigenous specific liquor offenses were repealed. and the authority for liquor legislation on reserves was transferred to band councils. So we're talking recent history. And ultimately, Indigenous alcohol prohibition was done in the kind of mixed service of preventing racial mixing, maintaining white and by default Christian cultural dominance, and generating profit for the settler state. And these are really the same motivations that led to the passage of the 1908 Opium Act, which targeted predominantly Chinese immigrants, as well as the 1911 Opium and Drug Act, and really all anti-narcotics legislation that came after it, including today's CDSA. And prohibition has also always been kind of a sorting mechanism for capitalism. And I will say that just because the motivations for prohibition have been to stratify racial groups does not mean, of course, that prohibition only impacts racialized people. And we need to see prohibition really as fundamentally about economics, which has a racial dimension. But anyone kind of regardless of race who is deemed, unproductive under a capitalist economic system will be penalized for it. And prohibition was and still is a key mechanism for kind of doling out that punishment. And so this is why we see so many sick, disabled, and poor people, as well as people who generate income through illegal or quasi-legal means, have criminal records or be incarcerated for drug-related offenses. And I will expand on this a little bit, but just to kind of synthesize what I've said, the farther one kind of drifts from this archetypical, white, straight, able-bodied, economically productive ideal upon which this country was founded, the more vulnerable they're going to be to the effects of drug prohibition as a tool of ongoing settler colonialism and capitalism. So in terms of kind of the material consequences of the current state of the law, sorry. So again, prohibition really continues to serve the same ideological and economic functions that it always has. Of course, settler colonialism is an ongoing project. And although today's drug laws are not explicitly race-based, they continue to have disproportionate impacts on Indigenous and racialized groups. Indigenous people are starkly overrepresented among those who are arrested and charged for drug-related offenses, experiencing drug-related stigma and discrimination within the healthcare system, subjected to child apprehension through the so-called child welfare system due to drug use, and of course, dying from accidental overdose. And so too are kind of other racialized groups, and again, poor people, disabled people, low-income workers, and people who engage in illegal or quasi-legal income generation. And I will say that not only have kind of the underlying economic and ideological functions of prohibition not changed, they've become more necessary. And in terms of kind of specifying prohibition's ideological functions, the construction of this kind of archetype of the criminal addict through policy and law has become even more valuable and necessary to kind of political and economic elites as material inequalities increase. And what I mean by this is that across the country, rates of poverty and homelessness are going up. More and more people are struggling to meet their basic needs in a variety of ways. And rather than kind of concede or admit that this is a pretty predictable result of kind of life under a capitalist economic system, again, political and economic kind of elites are very quick to blame drug use and users. For instance, it is very common for politicians to refer to homeless encampments and other spaces where poverty is most visible as drug dens, and to paint people living in tents as drug addicts who are, very responsible for their own misfortune. This allows them to evade accountability for problems their decisions are causing by really downloading responsibility for them onto the individual. It also allows them and others to profit from these same problems. And so this kind of brings me to prohibition's ongoing economic functions. And we have kind of this weird paradox where prohibition is simultaneously very profitable and very expensive. And your interpretation of whether it's profitable or expensive is really going to depend on kind of your social location and ultimately how much power you have. So in terms of how prohibition is profitable, I would say first and most obviously, it justifies directing massive resources to policing institutions and prisons. And in this way, it functions to maintain class divisions because only a very small, generally wealthy segment of the population benefit from over-policing, while most folks do not, regardless of whether or not they use drugs. And I want to just kind of briefly nod to current events. and current events kind of coming out of the US, we have seen recently now kind of this threat of American tariffs or economic sanctions justified by claims of fentanyl trafficking, and this idea that fentanyl is, passing from the Canadian to the US side of the border. In response, our federal government has named a fentanyl czar and agreed to list cartels as terrorists. And a lot of this is symbolic, but the practical effect of kind of these decisions will be that we are going to see even more increased resources to policing the border and policing more generally, increased surveillance of undocumented people or people who are suspected of being undocumented, and just poor people. And of course, then by extension, we will see even fewer resources directed to health and social services that would benefit everyone. And so in other words, kind of all communities will be harmed by the stated need to stop drug trafficking, regardless of whether trafficking is actually occurring at the rate and volume that politicians and police claim it is. Prohibition also keeps a lot of people employed, and this includes people in the not-for-profit and academic sectors. We see large resources directed towards frontline services for drug users, for example. And many of the problems that frontline services kind of need to exist to address are the results of prohibition and could actually be solved or mitigated by allowing people to access a legal regulated drug supply. Similarly, many researchers have built their careers kind of studying the consequences of drug-related stigma and discrimination rather than advocating to eliminate drug-related stigma and discrimination via a legal and regulated supply of drugs. And I want to emphasize here that doesn't mean that most frontline workers and researchers aren't well-intended. I'm sure some are in this room today, and I know you are. But we are all kind of part of this broader ecosystem that treats prohibition as natural and inevitable, and really requires prohibition to keep the rest of our social systems and institutions functioning. Prohibition also justifies the existence of a private for-profit addiction treatment sector. And I want to touch on something that has kind of shifted actually in recent years that we haven't seen historically to the same extent. And that's really this kind of merging or twinning of criminal and medicalized or health adjacent responses to drug use. You may have heard growing calls for involuntary addiction treatment coming from municipal and provincial governments, as well as the federal opposition party. This, of course, occurs even though voluntary treatment is inaccessible and without any promise to address kind of the structural drivers of addiction, such as poverty and homelessness. And often this involuntary treatment or forced abstinence is framed as a compassionate intervention for people who are too addicted and unwell to make good choices. And, for example, Alberta's Compassionate Intervention Act literally makes this explicit. And it really is important to point out not just that this is not an evidence-based solution and it actually is associated with probably increased likelihood of fatal overdose, but it's a really profitable solution to a few people. Addiction treatment is not included in the Canada Health Act, and it is thus kind of allowed to be administered without any of the principles that applies to Canada's system of universal health care. So it's one of the few areas of Canadian healthcare that is largely privatized already. And many of the loudest advocates for involuntary treatment and regressive drug policy more broadly own or are employed as consultants and staff at private addiction treatment centers. And this includes prominent addiction medicine physicians and some addictions researchers, all of whom really stand to benefit personally from ramping up involuntary treatment and just the drug war. And despite claims of compassion, this is really just incarceration by another name. And in some cases, of course, people will literally be incarcerated if they refuse treatment or fail to complete it. And I want to kind of draw a link between what is happening now and historically kind of the civilizing or so-called civilizing narratives that justified settler colonialism here to begin with. And I'll just repeat a quote that is offered, colonialism does not end, it just takes different forms. And that is the same with drug criminalization, because it's an expression of colonialism. So that all sounds real bad, it is. But we are connected to other movements. And on the one hand, I can sit here and say like settler colonialism, now imperialism, capitalism, these are global systems that no one can escape. And that's really overwhelming because they can feel intractable. A slightly more optimistic read is that this also offers us really significant opportunities to build alliances with other movements because we are all impacted by the same system. We are intimately linked to one another, and our movements are connected. So in terms of how we are connected, Sorry, I'm looking at the time and realizing I need to hurry up. I think it's important to kind of point out how we're all kind of being subjected to these potentially more kinder, gentler forms of social control. So the same kind of sad, sick rhetoric that is applied to some drug users is also applied to poor people more generally, certainly trans people, people who do sex work, disabled people, people who are living with HIV. And the same narrative is kind of used to identify or to categorize all of our various identities into these kind of artificial predator and victim categories. So with drug criminalization, we see, this archetype of the drug trafficker being framed as a predator and the victim kind of the sad user. We also see when it comes to sex workers, this archetypical human trafficker being a predator and people who do sex work sometimes being framed as victims of them. And this applies to kind of all of us. Similarly, we are all being affected by how kind of narratives around saving the children or wanting to protect children from exposure to XYZ bad thing are being deployed to justify criminalization. And for all of us, someone who is labeled a victim, that status can be revoked really easily the second we advocate for our own autonomy, at which point folks are kind of recategorized as predators and treated accordingly. So this gives us opportunities to kind of see similarities and work together. And I would just say quickly, it would behoove all of us to identify policies and laws that would benefit all movements and people. I think sometimes we risk getting necessarily focused on some pretty narrow policy reforms that would just impact kind of the demographic we speak on behalf of. But something, for example, like having a robust not-for-profit healthcare system would benefit everyone in this room. And I'll let you use your imagination to kind of flesh out the details there because I don't have time to. We also, I think, need to kind of build really broad coalitions by emphasizing our similarities rather than our differences. Resist efforts to sow divisions between us, and recognize that there is a place for everyone in movement building. I think it's fair to say that movements often risk becoming quite insular. We sometimes propagate cultures of like almost celebrity activism and the assumption that only a few people are capable of leading. I would argue that everyone has a place in movement building, irrespective of kind of what your background or skill set looks like. And I would encourage everyone to also think really carefully about how we're defining the term lived experience even and to what ends. My observation, being in kind of a variety of different spaces over the years associated with many of my identities, is that lived experience can be really poorly defined and can contain some faulty assumptions about like how it shapes people's politics. And speaking to kind of drug users specifically, and I'll draw from my own lived experience here, I spent a lot of years kind of cycling through abstinent and 12-step based addiction treatment. And I was like really, I will say, oppressed during those years. But I was also told that it was totally my fault and I had a brain disease and that I needed to pray and sacrifice and repent. And as a result, like in my teens and early 20s was opposed to harm reduction. So although at the time I had living experience of being homeless, being forcibly institutionalized, I don't look back and feel proud of my politics, which is just an example of how I think we need to, just be cautious about assuming that someone is going to believe a certain thing or act a certain way just based on their lived experience, and return to the idea that we are all impacted by these overarching systems and structures. We need to practice solidarity, both domestically and across borders. And I will stop talking now. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. That was awesome. And also thanks for pushing the boundary and kind of like talking to the people in the room today about some of the language that we use and how we apply it. There's so much I could add, but all I will say is nothing that we're not gonna tackle later today and nothing that we haven't tackled last week. We hosted a webinar on bodily autonomy with an abortion rights group, a trans rights group, a substance use in the workplace group. And so we can put the link in the chat because there's a lot of really valuable information in that other webinar too about connecting our movements and about what we can do to stand together in front of these harmful policies that are affecting all of us, even though we are siloed. But without further ado, I want to welcome our next perspective today, which is when we're thinking of stigma, I think this perspective is challenging for a lot of us, the perspective of migrant sex workers. But I think by kind of hearing all these stories today, I hope everyone can be open to the facts and the experiences that Hélène Lam, who I will invite to speak right now, will share with us today. So go for it, Hélène.
Hi, how are you? I'm Elaine. I'm from Butterfly Asian and Migrant Sex Workers Support Network. So it is my honor to be on this panel. It is so great, 200 people in this webinar. And I think as other speakers say, so this is not the panel you only learn about the information. We need your solidarity. We need you to be part of the movement. So when you hear the criminalization of HIV, you hear the criminalization of like drug use and many criminalizations. So, and I think many of you also witness what have been happened in your work, in your network, or even your friends, family. So that's why I think it's very important having this panel, how to bring us together, and then how we can build the solidarity to fight with each other. Not fight with each other, it's like fight together. So, and so, yeah, and Butterfly is an Asian and Migrant Sex Worker Support Network. So we organize Asian and Migrant sex worker. And so at other speaker have say, you know, in Canada, we know that it's a long history of like criminalization of drugs use, criminalization of like people are homeless or poor, and also like the HIV is also being criminalized. We know that like migrant sex worker is also being criminalized in so many ways. This happened not only now, it's 100 years, you know, keep going, but they criminalize us in so many different ways. And people think that Canada is like improving. But when we see what happened now, actually no, right? So that we find that it is so powerful because criminalization is disproportionately affect indigenous, black, racialized migrant. The bigger project is continues the colonialism, racism, like white supremacy, xenophobia, ableism, capitalism, and also uphold the nationalism, right? So that is, we know that the criminalization is not only, you know, say someone is doing, you know, like some people we need to criminalize that, but they are the big purpose behind it. And they control the movement of people, they control the sexuality of people, they control the rights of people. And ethnic say they continues uphold the benefit of some class of people in our society, right? And also uphold the xenophobia also, and particularly with the recent anti-migrant sentiment. And they make some people become disproportional. When I call you criminal, I call you engage in like criminal activity, your voice has been taken away. Your voice, your power have been taken away. I can put you in prison, I can put you in mental health facility, that I can control you so easy by just impose you the label. And so we need to ask why middle class people can occupy the park. But when homeless people use drugs, they use the park to build a community, to connect with each other. And even survive, it becomes illegal, right? When we think that like in this, like under capitalism, everyone is using our body to earn money. But when sex workers use the body to earn money, to survive or economic advancement become illegal, right? When there is like HIV people being excluded of accessing drugs and they are being criminalized for not control your vital loads, right? So that is ridiculous. But what powerful of criminalization, because they construct the illegality. They make people believe, they create an illusion they are the bad people, they are the wrong people, they are disproportionate people. No matter we say we are combat the crime, we construct all these people as criminal, organized crime, or we construct they are the vulnerable people, we need to like rescue them, now force them to have the like treatment facility when there is like no low barrier accessible like treatment for people, right? So that is something we know that is very problematic. But that's why I think this panel is so important, because so often we do not have so much space in the public media, right? We do not have a lot of space. We make our voices being heard. So that's why I think this is the space very important. We continue to learn from each other, because sometimes we have like work with specific group people, there is a lot of intersect of identity, but we may not know about the struggle. And I think particularly as migrant, we are being told the false story. We need to adopt the whiteness. We need to adopt this like white middle class value to be Canadian. It's no, right? This no, like white supremacy is not Canadian value. That we need to know about the colonialism. We need to learn about this month is like Black History Month. We need to know how the racism is not in the past, but is ongoing. So the how classism is being like used in so many ways. And how people being blamed, right? We know that now have so many election is coming, how migrant being scapegoat. They are being scapegoat. For example, they say they bring the housing crisis, but you see thousands empty condo in Toronto, and then you say they are the problem? No, the problem is you commodify housing. Your housing policy is make housing become an investment. We see all our retirement fund go to this like big corporate to buy the apartment and the condo become money making. This is the wrong of the housing policy, but they blame the migrant, right? The blaming construction of illegality also create the hate and discrimination. And many of those problematic ideology already people have. But then they justify it, right? So that also you occupy the past part, you do the drugs, you engage criminal activity, I can kick you away. But this is just basically the discrimination of people use drugs, of racialized people, right? So we know in Canada, I need to say, so many people use drugs, right? And when we say people use drugs, who are the people use drugs being criminalized, right? So many people use drugs, but because of the class, because of the race, they have access to drug in certain way, they are not being criminalized, right? So that basically those people are criminalized because of their poor, because of the people of color. And we also see like the expansion of like the criminalization recently, like many of the speaker mentioned about Ontario. So they shut down the harm reduction sites. They like have a lot of policy, criminalization of drugs use, homeless. And then when they have no funding, with no funding, $300 million for anti-trafficking. What is anti-trafficking? Actually, is anti-sex work. Is racial profiling one organization? I need to name them. Canadian Center to End Human Trafficking. They got $40 million to run the hotline. How do they help anyone? They help the government to do surveillance, and they ask the city of Toronto to shut down of the massage parlor. It's not enough. It's not the, we always say we don't have enough resources to have housing policy. We don't have enough enough resources. It's not because of not having enough resources, just is where do they spend the money, how they use the criminalization again to increase the policing, increase the state power. So that's why I think this is very important, need to aware of that. And so I would like to talk a bit more about the criminalization of migrant sex worker. And also we use like the Causeway web. Many of us know the criminal law is the major way of criminalize people. People will be put in prison, incarcerated, HIV, drug use, homeless, mental health, poor people. And sex work, right? Sex worker have been saying criminalization do not protect sex worker. Criminalization cause a lot of harm, but the federal government still passed the law to criminalization of sex work. But they, again, to lie, right? They say sex worker is not criminalized. It's not true. Sex worker is still criminalized, right? But many people accept that. And so they are very like successful to sell this poison candy, particularly those people claim themselves feminists. I don't call them feminists because those Causeway feminists, they love police prison than people, right? The anti-sex worker group. They use human trafficking. Again, they draw a lot of attention. I'm saving, helping the people, right? So the criminalization of sex work, still fighting, and Canadian Alliance of Sex Work Law Reform and many sex worker group doing the Constitution Challenge. But I think our fight is more than the court, right? So we need your support. We need your support. Sex worker should not be the crime. Sex workers should have the right to sell the sex, so they are not the public nuisance, they are not the harm of the society, right? The other part is the immigration law. Anyone engaged with sex work, so that is violate the immigration law, they will kick them away. And also now we can see with the change of immigration policy, more and more people will become undocumented. And when you undocumented, this also limited the way of you earn living. We can see like some people may engage in sex work because they cannot like work in other industry, and some people like continues to work in sex industry even they have document, they may become like lost their status because they found they work in sex industry, right? So that Butterfly is part of Migrant Rights Network. We are fighting for status for all. We need you to help, because I think in many discussion about criminalization, very rare like migrant issue being discussed, but many of speakers mentioned like actually migrant is a very like being affected in so many way, and like being kept in like so many way of criminalization. And municipal bylaw, right, in addition, you know, to criminalize people homeless, recently again the trafficking group created panic of Asian massage parlor. People are like being trafficked. Asian women, they use the racist idea: you don't speak English, you cannot consent, let me rescue you. But we can see they criminalize like different racial people, racialized people in different way, right? They will see like the black people, you are the gangster, you know, the trafficker of the drug, and then Asian woman, you are the poor traffic victim. But the actually consequently the same, you're being arrested and deported, right? So like, and that is so problematic. So we can see many city now is criminalized massage parlor, and we remember how illegality is being produced, right? Doing massage is something good, and then how they make it become illegal, and then they can arrest the people or they charge the people. And like in Toronto now is doing the bylaw review. A few years ago, they threatened to shut down 400 massage parlor, 2,000 workers will lost the job. And now even Ministry of Labor, we think labor law is protecting the worker, but all over Ontario, the Ministry of Labor, again, is because of lobbying of Center to End Human Trafficking. They now go to massage parlor, say, you do not comply with the employment law, let me like punish you, and then you need to provide all the information of your employee, right? So that kind of expansion of policing, not only police, not only by law enforcement officer, even like public health, you know, like Ministry of Labor is so like scaring, because when they are not only having the criminalization of police, the level of control can be like also very, very powerful, and the violence can be less visible. Particularly, I think Nicole talk about how criminalization through the mental health care system, and now we can also see how expand to the social worker, right? How the social worker and the mental, like the healthcare provider, is become part of surveillance, part of the control. If we really see criminalization, it's not only criminal law. If we see criminalization, it's control of the freedom of people, control of the agency of people, control of sexuality and movement of people, that we can be more visible. We can see how so many people are being criminalized in so many ways. And because now so many sectors come together, it's make people more difficult. And many of you, I believe many of you is already like working in this sector, and we can see how funding and management can drive you from supporting become the role of surveillance, right? So for example, we see a lot of harm reduction program shift to anti-trafficking program. Before, the people came in and they asked, do you need food? Do you need something? And now they have to check list, who are you working with, are you being controlled, right? So that is something we also need to aware. So that's why when we talk about solidarity, many speakers talk about, and learning from each other is very, very important part. And also thinking is not what other people can do, right? What we can do together. And particularly now how we can work together, the decriminalization of you know, decriminalization movement is not only like take away the criminal law, but how, you know, we need to abolish like prison, police, but also all this state power control, particular through the health and like social work system, and how we can have the system put the power and resources on those who are marginalized, right? When we have the power, how we can support the community, they can access the power because they know the solution the best, right? People use drugs, they know that how they can like keep each other safe. But many of their practice is become illegal. Migrant sex workers, they know how to support each other. When I don't know how to speak English, someone translate for me. When I cannot drive, so someone drop me off. But it's all become illegal activity, right? So that's why when we say we really want to transform the society, take away the criminal law is important part, but also how to end the colonialism, racism, and then we do not only need you to be our allies. We want you to include us in your movement. We want you to include us in your work. And many of social service sector, people in health professional, they feel they are so tired, they cannot do anything. But don't underestimate your power. Election is coming, but also in your site, you can still do a lot of work to resist and make the change, how to bring our voices to your sector. And so we need to have like more solidarity with this very difficult time. And in this difficult time, the like creative resistance is very important. And thank you for everyone. It is my honor to be here. And thank you for other panelists. I learned a lot from you guys. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Elaine, for connecting all these dots and presenting that perspective. So I know everyone in the audience are probably like, okay, but what do we do now? What do we do now? So that's why I'm very happy to introduce our next panelists. But first, one of the panelists will be speaking French. If you haven't turned on your interpretation, click the globe button with interpretation at the bottom of your screen and click English. We'll put the instruction in the chat. Also, we might only have time for 1 or 2 questions in the Q&A, but please still write the questions in the Q&A because those really help us. Your comments in the chat really help us just for our like future events, our future educational material, and who we want to connect with. So I'm really proud to have the next speakers be from Jojage, Montreal. It's the group Defund the SPVM, and I think they really exemplify what it means to, form a coalition and like a front of solidarity and do something about against the policing, the increased budget in policing, and the targeting of the most vulnerable among us. I don't know who's gonna speak first. Is it gonna be Ted or
Yeah, I'll
Laurent?
start.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Naja, and thanks for everybody else. It's a tough act to follow, both Elaine and Nicole and Muluba. I've learned so much from you today and in the past. So I'm Ted, and I'm going to speak about a coalition in Montreal that doesn't have a solution, but does suggest one way that we can organize in a way that addresses some of the cross-cutting harms, violences, and sources of vulnerability that other people have mentioned, and many that people haven't mentioned. So the Defund the SPVM coalition was formed in June 2020 in the context of the police murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Regis Korchinski-Paquette in Toronto, Chantal Moore in New Brunswick, eventually Sheffield Matthews in Montreal. The founding members of the coalition were largely women of color and sex workers who were already organizing against police violence and criminalization through an abolitionist lens. And in Quebec, we have to do the ridiculous thing of specifying that when we say abolition, we mean the abolition of the prison industrial complex and not the abolition of sex work. That should be evident, but here it isn't. And so I just want to say, 3 really important people aren't here today: Jessica Keano, Sandra Wesley, and Marlene Lopez, who really were important founding members of the coalition. Very quickly, we put out a call to potential members of the coalition. The coalition grew to 50 members very quickly. It's now 80 members. And with the members, we came up with a list of 10 demands that both expressed what we want and I think together articulated our vision of the kind of change and the kind of society we want to live in. And so, the most important for today are we called for the full decriminalization of drug, sex work, and HIV status. We also called for massive investments in harm reduction, other forms of well-being for communities, and called for a 50% cut in the SPVM budget, both because that's just a good thing and because we can fund all kinds of great things with that money. And so, if this is a model that maybe is useful in other contexts, I would say that it is potentially useful because of two things. One is it's a way to build power by tracing the multiple kinds of harms that the police create in different kinds of communities, and a way of talking about the different kinds of ways we want to keep each other safe. And so like Miriam Kaba often says that the way to abolish the police is not to replace it with one other thing. That's the conceit and the ideology of the police, that you can have one number you can call and have all of your safety needs met. And so having a coalition is really important, because what we want instead of the police is not just a different institution. We want things that are actually really tailored to the kinds of vulnerability, harm, and suffering that people face. So that's one thing. The second thing is it addresses an issue that a bunch of you have raised, which is that we're not just calling for an end to drug prohibition and a turn towards harm reduction. That would be great, and that would help lots of people, but it wouldn't be enough, because as other people have said, the prohibition model isn't just a faulty and misguided approach to dealing with the harms that can occur with drug use. It's also a way to control marginalized people. And I think, Stella and other sex workers organizations in the coalition have made this really clear, because they've seen it. You can eliminate one law and the police find other ways of controlling you. So we don't just want, the decriminalization of certain crimes that we don't think should be criminalized. We want to reduce the size of the police, so they can't just use another law or a bylaw or some other pretext to control the people that they want to control. And so, I won't keep you in suspense. We've been very unsuccessful in getting the government to defund the police. It's kind of this predicament that we see over and over and over again, where the left is very good at changing public opinion. The majority of Montrealers support defunding the police, like the majority of Montrealers support a ceasefire and a free Palestine. We support decriminalization, all these things, but popular opinion doesn't determine what actually happens. We have in Montreal a really horrible municipal government that sort of emits progressive vibes, but that is really in there to serve their base of property owners and small landlords, and do what Sandra Wesley again calls it the suburbanization of the city. They want to create an environment in the city where people who normally would live in the suburbs because it's sort of like chill and safe and you don't ever have to be bothered by anything, will feel comfortable living in the city. And so they've been brutal on the police. They've increased the budget in 2 consecutive years, more than any other time in Montreal history. They've refused to make any moves on decriminalization, or even removing, incredibly harmful anti-homeless bylaws. And so, the people sort of, I think, get the what needs to be done, but we don't at this point have any power to impose it. And so that's always the struggle. The ideas are there, the popular support is there, but the people who hold power, if they don't want to do it, they just don't have to. And so I'll pass it over to Laurent, who will talk about one of the working groups of the coalition that comes closest to the themes of today.
Merci, Ted.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you to the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition. It's a pleasure to be with you today. One of the groups, working group for the Defund the Police Coalition, it's Cities Without Overdose. And we have 2 requests that come from the coalition. It's drug decriminalization, and the working group was created 2 years ago, 2 years and a half ago, actually. And at that time, I'm just going to tell you the story of Cities Without Overdoses. We saw what was happening in British Columbia, with symptom exemption for certain drugs, and what was happening in Toronto. Toronto that also submitted a request, and we wanted to follow suit in Montreal by pressuring the city so they can present an exemption request to follow suit with what was happening in Vancouver and Toronto. That was our main objective of this working committee, Cities Without Overdoses. So the first year and a half, we used different strategies. Sorry, this is not for the interpreter. The first strategy, we wanted to present a motion to the municipal council to focus on municipal policies that exist in Montreal. So the party in power, Project Montreal, voted on a motion in 2021 that supported drug decriminalization, but without being accountable for it. So the idea between Cities Without Overdoses, we needed to find elected officials who would agree to present the motion and who would support it so it can be debated during the city council meetings. So we wanted to force the adoption of the motion, or we wanted to, Project Montreal to declare their intentions. And with everything that was going on in media, they seemed to support the project, but they didn't really act on it. Sorry, this is inaudible for the interpreter. We were ready to present our motion. There were several attempts that were made. And then at the end, they refused to support the presentation of this motion. Then we changed our strategy. We decided to meet with the opposition together in Montreal, Ensemble Montréal, so they could, within their caucus, they adopt a stance for drug criminalization to force this on the current municipal government. Of course, it was not a success. We're sharing our failures because it's also there are lessons to be learned to know what worked and what didn't. And when we had that use that second strategy with Together Montreal, the opposition party, we had meetings with elected officials, and we were able, they needed to ask the question during the caucus and that they would vote on it to see if they would adopt that stance favoring drug decriminalization. It's a vote that only involves the party and that is in camera, but apparently only 2 votes were necessary for the adoption of this motion. So we were not successful. And during all that time, during all this period where we tried to force and make sure that the motion would be put forward, and I'm just, this is a summary. All this time, the city tried to co-opt us and to use us publicly when it was good for their image, but without really responding to our requests, whether it be in the media or calling meetings and then talking to the media. We're still working on this issue. We've met this organization and that, and without really feeling that there was progress made.
So for this reason, we push this strategy aside. So we're looking to work more on initiatives that are looking at the needs of the community. So this is always something that our organization was looking at, but we're changing, pivoting our strategy so we can focus more on what are the actual needs of the communities that are surrounding us. So one of the communities that we're talking about is, let's say, community organizations and harm reduction that work with people who use drugs. But then also, I'm trying to think of other communities like Indigenous Support Project and
with them, we have Indigenous people who got together for brunch, spend time together in public areas, and then they quickly noticed that wherever they showed up, they'd have lots of police surveillance. So we wanted to support that initiative and go be with them to help them basically monitor the cops that were all around them. So this gave us a chance to be able to be closer with that community, to understand their needs, and just even the simple presence of having some white people hanging out would help get the police to move on. So, and that was something we'd be able to work on that relationship, and to talk and share what are your rights with dealing with the police. What happens if you get arrested? What are your rights? And so we continue to share ideas, talk about needs. And there's a network called My Chinatown Montreal. And we were able to link up with that group because one of our members who's involved in My Chinatown Montreal. And then quickly with that group, they could see increase in police surveillance and presence downtown in Chinatown in Montreal. And this was creating diverging opinions. And so My Chinatown Montreal did a whole organized day to invite us to come and talk about how we defund the police, decriminalizing drugs, to do that intersection of work. So we've done kiosks, tabling to share those ideas in Chinatown about these decrim ideas. So people were happy to hear about defunding the police. And but we also, this is how I wanted to share things that worked maybe a little less well, just so we can learn from this. There's also people who told us they didn't really get how could defunding the police change their daily lives. So we didn't want to see that as a pushback or a refusal. We just wanted to maybe see this as an opportunity to better understand the needs of the communities that we're working in, and to be able to question our own work and how can we better meet the needs of communities. Sometimes it's just a communication issue. So how can we be more maybe explicit on what could be the impacts on your daily life for the community, the people, the neighborhood, this clear Chinatown neighborhood in Montreal. So now I'm gonna pass it back to Tim to do a quick wrap up.
Thanks, Laurent. And we should leave the remaining 10 minutes for the Q&A. Looking forward to hearing the questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to all the speakers today. I will jump straight to the Q&A. So we have had many questions. I'm going to try to do a weird mashup of a couple of them. Thanks to my colleague Jess, we've been kind of like workshopping this. So let me just see. So could the speakers comment on the link between criminalization, prohibition, and the creation of illegal, unregulated markets, and whether highlighting this link would be a useful tactic in advocating for legal reforms? And I think there's also a way to expand this question beyond just the criminalization of illegal markets of drugs, but also applying this to the way sex work is criminalized, and if this applies to anything else. So, but if the panelists need any clarification for this question, let me know. But yeah, please feel free to just unmute and answer as you see fit.
I'll hop in. I'll try. Certainly, yeah, I mean, speaking to drug policy specifically, it is, drug prohibition that produces an unregulated market because there can be no quality controls or oversight throughout an illegal supply chain. That of course translates into much more dangerous use, and use being more dangerous than it ought to be. And I see certainly the parallels and intersections there with drug use and policy and sex work, of course. I think on the one hand, it's fair to say that when there is kind of a consumer demand for a good or service, that demand will be met. If it's not able to be met legally, then it will be met illegally. That being said, I think it's important to emphasize that we are not necessarily in a historical moment where like reality, like empirical reality, necessarily matters to decision makers. And so I think that poses some complications. When I, started this job a number of years ago now, I think I very naively believed that at least like some people in positions of power would be persuaded by evidence. I'm no longer convinced of that. So I think what it comes down to then is looking to collaborate at the more grassroots level, because I think we're still at a point where if public opinion on something shifts dramatically to one side or the other, people in power are still forced to an extent to listen to that. So I think tactically, what makes sense again is trying to do that really broad tent movement building, and to advocate for both the decriminalization and where it's appropriate, legalization and regulation. I know that can be a bit different for drug use and sex work, but advocate for similar or kind of identical ends at the grassroots level to bring other people in. That was a really messy answer. I'm sorry, I didn't have a ton of time to refine a response. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think like particularly I think from sex work we can see, any particular under capitalism, right? Racism. So that is like a certain thing is being controlled in certain way to benefit certain people, right? So that we know that like a lot of law and policy is being created the way to include some people, exclude some people. And often because in Canada we always being trained and shaped so that the black market is bad, we need to make everything become legitimacy, right? But we do not see actually is the resistance, right? So like, for example, racialized migrant sex worker, because of the anti-migrant policy, migrant you cannot work. So that's why they creatively to find a way they to continues to work, right? So that if we think that like I think this is a very important question when we talk about the crime is the relationship of people of the state, right? Because I think we're being trained the state should design the rule for us and then we need to follow. And some people support decriminalization so that like drugs and sex workers should be contained in the way in certain framework, right? So they still can control under the state. But if we really revisit our relationship with the state, that how actually our community can have the more power to decide what is the best way of the community, how the infrastructure of the society, social system, and support that we do not create the illegality so that then the people we have different form, we do not have the like on the table market and black market, we don't need to have that division, right? So I think this is something is a little bit abstract, but that is something I like transformative justice because we need to emerge in other kind of social system and we need to recognize. And if we have like the legalization of sex work, criminalization of sex work with a lot of control, we know that migrant sex workers like New Zealand, they were not able to work anymore, right? So that's why we need to take away all kind of state control. We need the people believe that people should have the power and right to have their own body autonomy, to have like the economic activity practice. And we can see so many economic social system, as Nicole say, is being used, to maintain some like ruling class or people benefits from that, right? So, and I think that is something encourage people to think bigger in addition to the what kind of market we create, but how we can transform to the society that we can have the society that people can survive or like develop, and live with so many different form, right? So thank you.
And if I can maybe just very quickly add on those two excellent answers, is that we saw, I think, especially with the presentation of Muluba, that like policy change can take a lot of time, and sometimes we like the needs are here and now. So I think we also have to think about solutions, the grassroots solution that the community can apply right now in parallel, while building that broader movement to change the policy at the national level or governmental level, but also not forget that the community individual have needs right now, and it's also important that the community is able to organize itself to answer those needs and help the one that have those needs actually.
Thanks so much, everyone. I won't be asking another question. We're reaching the end. Before closing, I just want to ask our panelists if there's any last words that you would like to share that you haven't been able to share, or just from hearing the conversation. No pressure. I'll just leave you the floor.
Thank you so much for having us and putting that first stone to building a much broader movement. I think it's very important. It's been an honor to be here.
Well, thank you so much, Laurent, for this. And thanks, everyone, just for your knowledge and generosity today. I think if there's any takeaway, there's a lot of takeaways today. So I'm not going to try to sum them all up. But I think it's really important that we get to a place where our messaging and our demands gets to the roots of things, and where we have where we're able to advocate for the same things when we're talking to our audiences, to our friends, our families, our politicians, the media, because I think that will send a strong message if we're able to all agree that our healthcare systems are failing us, that the housing market is failing us, and that the solutions that are put forward are basically to punish people for problems that they didn't make, and for responding to these problems with the most logical options that they have in front of them. And then when those solutions are linked to criminal activity or criminalized activities or illegal activities, then that the solution is either to be treated involuntarily or to fill the pockets of people who can benefit from them being put in this situation in the first place. So thank you so much, everyone. Take a deep breath after this. There's a lot of information. And thanks for all the great comments in the Q&A. We will be sending out a recording and all the relevant links and resources. I'll invite the panelists to stay for a brief debrief. And everyone else, have an excellent day. And we'll see you at one of our later events. Take care.